Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Desiato. I'm the Professional Development and Events Manager for Bedford Free North Publishing Group. I'm going to turn it over to Renee and Robin because they've created a really lovely presentation based on your feedback and your questions. But just one quick housekeeping note, like I said before, I will be muting everyone. Just to cut down on background, you can send a message to me through the chat feature. Just select host and I will get back to you. A lot of the presentation that we have for you today is Q&A, but if questions do come up, send them to me using the chat and I will pass them along to Robin and Renee. So I will do that now. Over to you guys.
Robin,
Hi, everybody.
Got bounced out of the meeting. So it says I have one meeting in progress. I'm trying to get back in. So I'm going to ask you to get started there with the first slide. And I will just open by saying thank you all so much for coming tonight, and thank you for sending in these great questions.
Yeah, wonderful questions. We really, really appreciate it. Great. Okay, so
Robin, I'm having trouble getting back in here. I'm going to have to get out and then get back in. So it will take me probably 1 minute. So here we go.
Okay.
I'm good. I'm good.
There
Okay.
you are.
All right. Well, first of all, Nicole, you're going to start the slides here, right? So we are going to talk a little bit about what we're going to do tonight.
Yep.
We're going to start by talking about the second edition, and Robin and I are determined to keep this to about, we hear dogs. We're going to keep this as not my Lily. We're going to keep this to the opening to just a few minutes, if possible, because we really loved the questions you sent in, and they gave us lots of opportunities to talk about this new edition. Anyway, so I hope you all have a copy, and if you don't, I know you get a copy for asking questions. And I think that the opening quote from Emerson speaks probably as well as any, which is the creative reading as well as creative writing. We believe that, and so that is our opening chapter, the active engaged reader. We have a great deal of emphasis on writing here, but it is ways to engage students in reading, and we know these days with all the competition, that's not such an easy thing to do.
But we also know that for this course, it's really so much about the reading. The strong readers will catch up with their writing, so we really focus on the reading in these opening chapters as well. Okay, Nicole, next slide.
Yeah. Robin, why don't you take this one?
Okay. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about what's new here and the things that we really paid attention to when we prepared to write the second edition. So the thing that I'm proudest of in this is this full new chapter on the analysis of poetry. And we're going to come back to that in a little bit. A little bit more emphasis on the analysis of effect, so, focusing more on not just recognizing the literary strategies, but really being able to notice and write about the effect of them, increase attention to writing, and very important, more full works that are appropriate for question 3. And then, because we feel it's very important and because students love it, there are a lot of visual texts for students to practice analysis on. So often they're more comfortable taking a risk with a visual text than with a written text, but those skills then apply to the writing. Okay?
Yeah, and I want to say,
hold
on 1 second. I want to just say here a couple things. Those of you who are familiar with the first edition who might not have seen the second edition yet, the first edition had a close reading chapter, as you know. There were the opening chapter, the introduction, and the close reading. And one of the things we decided was that given everything we hear from teachers and everything from the chief reader, that the poetry question we know is always problematic, the lowest score, and also just it's difficult to get kids engaged in close reading of poetry. So we've separated those two. We always resist the textbook being test prep. We know that the course is as important as the test, and in some ways more important as you're preparing kids for college. But this time there really is a full chapter on writing about nonfiction, a full chapter writing about poetry, and then the usual chapter about writing about longer works and themes. And there are some changes to that chapter, but that one is more the same as it was. But the poetry chapter is completely new, and I think you'll find the close reading chapter on fiction pretty new as well. So, next slide. Next slide is about...
Go ahead. We've added quite a few contemporary poets and diverse voices to the book, and here's a list of some of them, but honestly, there are more than these. There are some in each of the thematic chapters. Very interesting poets and writers who bring new perspectives to the poetry, but also in an interesting way reinventing some of the traditions and form and use of figurative language that, you know, your students will know and will be able to examine in voices that are a little bit more contemporary and maybe a little bit more, shall we say, relatable.
Let me also say, I've put in a plug here. Amit Majmudar is the one in the right-hand corner, the bottom right, and as Camille pointed out, I'm now living in Columbus, Ohio, and he is our first ever poet laureate. He's also a radiologist, and if you were in my workshop last summer in New York, you got to do a webinar with him. So we're very...
And he's also been published in the New Yorker quite a few times in the last couple of years.
That's right, Robin. He has. He's done very well. So we're pleased to have the poet laureate of the country in here, but also some other voices, some new voices. So I think that will be helpful to your students as well. And by the way, I apologize. I think it's the end of the day, and I'm getting calls here. So I'm sorry. I think we're hearing them beep in, but we should be finished.
No, we're not.
Okay. Next slide, please, Nicole.
It's there.
One of the things that we wanted to be able to do for this book, because we're very mindful of several things. One is cost. And the fact that if you're buying the book, you might see, well, how am I going to balance this with my budget for longer works? Because, of course, you want students to read longer works. And also, we were mindful of the fact that if students are going to spend a lot of time on these works, the kind of questions that we're asking, we hope will be really helpful for them so that they'll be able to use the works on the exam, and they'll also have a real in-depth understanding. The Metamorphosis was in the first edition, but this time it's actually featured as a central work. Senses, which we have Denzel and Viola Davis, probably at least being nominated for Academy Awards, and that wonderful movie is there from the first edition, as is Heart of Darkness and The Importance of Even Ernest and Hamlet. We also added another Shakespeare play, Othello, which is one of my very favorites, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later, and the full text of Frankenstein. I think we have a slide that follows this one, which we'll just flip by, but you might want to look at it. The New York Times recently did a piece on the fact that it's the 200th anniversary, and there are going to be 2 new movies coming out, and the Learning Network, in our Learning Network at the time, has a number of resources. But again, this time we have here 7 works. And granted, you may want to do some other work, independent reading or other common text for the class, but you really would have sufficient full works here, including 2 Shakespeare plays and a 19th century novel, and just barely moving into on the cusp of the 20th century with Heart of Darkness, as well as a more contemporary work there with Senses. So I think you will be able to offer your students a great deal with this book alone, and then whatever additional resources that you put into it. I think the next slide is a link to that New York Times article. So Nicole, let's just skip that one and move right on to the following slide.
Which is also a link, but why don't you explain?
Yeah, what we've done now is to talk. We're going to talk again. I keep saying briefly. We are going to talk here, and we need slide 7, Nicole, and that is that to organize this workshop, this webinar, one of the things we did was go into the question and answers from the chief reader this year, Warren Carson, and look at what advice does Dr. Carson give us to work with our students. Based on his understanding of student performance in the last several years, he's been involved as chief reader, this was his last year, I believe, that what advice does he give to teachers? And so what we thought we would do is to look at the advice he gives to teachers for each of the essay questions, and then to talk about how this new edition addresses that advice and implements that advice. Nicole, we need to go to slide 8 probably to start with poetry.
Okay, so I mean, I'll just go over these slides quickly, and then I can talk a little bit later about what we did in the poetry chapter, but to instruct students in precise reading. And, you know, I think many of us have had the experience of our students being enthusiastic about poetry, not hating it, but their method of analysis is to see, oh, I see this, and it connects to this, and then they can't really follow through. So this, you know, to move beyond the first level reading. To instruct them not just in terminology, but in applying the terminology in their analysis, and of course to having students write more, from constructing thesis statements to reader response to more formal composition.
Now the next slide we talk about how we're doing this. So Robin did
let me
chapter. So
let me talk a little bit about this poetry chapter. You know, as I said, you know, it's hard for us to encourage our students to do some deep analysis. And what we did in this chapter is really provide almost like an instruction manual. This is what you do with poetry. And there are probably a lot of different ways to approach this. But what we focused on were 2 steps. One is to read literally and paraphrase. The second is to consider the speaker. And the third is to read for detail. You know, one of the things we noticed when we look back at old exams was how often the question was, what is the speaker's attitude toward the subject? So we came up with methods for students to reach an answer to that question. So, you know, when we ask them to consider the speaker, we look at diction, we look at shifts and attitude. When we read for detail, we look at figurative language and imagery and structure and form and meter and sound. And then we spend some time in the chapter connecting those elements. We model analysis, we have activities for the students to try for each of these, and then we go on to writing about poetry, step by step. How to start with the thesis, pre-writing, graphic organizer, developing a thesis statement, how to organize an essay, how to integrate quotes, and we have sample essays for both a standalone single poem and also for paired poems. So it's really, I think, the kind of chapter that you might spend time with at the beginning of the course and really go through with your students, have them read it, have them practice the activities, and have them do it step by step so that they internalize this method for approaching poetry, both for discussion and for writing.
You know, I'm going to follow up with what Robin has been saying here because we had a number of questions about how, you know, kids just don't know what to do. They just look at the poem, they don't know what to do, they restate it, whatever. And these 3 steps, each one asks them to get into the analysis more deeply. And, you know, I know it's linear. I know that, you know, you're going to say, well, they'll have to go back and forth and it becomes iterative. And all of that's true. But again, I go back to Peter Elbow years ago saying, if you want to learn how to teach, go take a course in something that you're bad at, because that's when you really learn how to teach. And these questions here are, you know, the steps, I mean, not the questions, but the steps are really helpful to, I think they might be helpful to most students, but they're certainly helpful to the students who really are struggling with what is this close reading and what's the point of it. Well, here are at least 3 things you can do to get into it in a very significant way. So I
think there is also steps that are helpful for teachers. I mean, you know, we're expected to sort of, you know, have these instant, you know, to be 5 steps ahead of the kids, and some of these poems are hard for us too. And I think they're steps that we can practice and work through with our students and see a particular result. The result being they can answer a prompt, they can write an essay in class, they can have a discussion that goes beyond free association. So anyway, I think it will be helpful to everybody.
We hope so.
Yeah.
All right, so now
Okay,
we're going to move on to the reading fiction. And these are, again, from Dr. Carson. He advises us to help students understand how to analyze by asking questions of the passage. And he says help students embrace complexity. Of course, complexity, those of you who've taken my workshops know we talk about complexity all the time. The scoring guide always talks about complexity, but that's really what literature is all about. Help students embrace complexity in order to avoid answering the prompt so quickly that they oversimplify both the message and the passage. He also talks about encouraging students to consider the passage in its entirety and drawing support from throughout the passage as they develop their arguments. He also suggests that they practice with short stories because then they have more and more and more practice and they can apply that those skills to their longer works. But let's then go to the next slide and talk about how we do this in this chapter. Which we first of all have different literary strategy, or different strategies. So we go from first impressions to questions. So there's definitely that element of talking with the text, helping the kids figure out how to talk with the text, whether you're doing that with a partner or whether you're just doing it by writing response to the text. And then we talk about literary elements and style and go right from analysis to essay. And I can't tell you how many presentations I've done in my life where I talk about all sorts of good analytical techniques. And at the end, people say, but then how do you turn it into an essay? So really made an effort here to do that. The passages we use are very often shorter passages, as they are on the exam. They're excerpts. But I think we have a nice range here from Zora Neale Hurston, F. Scott Fitzgerald, of course, George Eliot, Thomas Hardy, B.S. Naipaul, and Willa Cather. Our sample essay is on Reunion by John Cheever, which is a short story that was on the exam many, many years ago, but it's the full story. I think that also emphasizes to students how you can do that close reading on a short passage from Middlemarch, but you also can work with a full short story. And in fact, it's advantageous to do so. On the exam, we've had a few. We had 11 by Sandra Cisneros. We had The Birthday Party and Reunion by Cheever. But it's hard to find the ones that are short enough to be on the exam. The culminating activity is the same thing. It's a close reading, but I just want to bring it up here because we were very happy that we got permission to use an excerpt from Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison. We aren't always so fortunate to get access, but this time we did. Okay, so we go on to the open question. Robin, you want to start this one or take this one?
Well, I mean, here what he suggested was to continue to instruct students in organization and development of an idea, and to help them see the hand of the author at work, and to appreciate how authorial choices both respond to audience but also shape meaning. And those are very sophisticated skills, of course. But one of the things that we've done here to help with that, of course, is we have really good scaffolding questions after these major texts. But we've also added a new feature, which is text in context. And Renee, I think you're the one who should speak about that.
I will. I'll be happy to. Nicole, can we go to the next slide here? And we probably needed to edit out that part in red. But what we've done this time, last time, we had conversations in the first edition, and many teachers said, well, we don't really do those kinds of conversations in the class. We don't have time. They're kind of interesting maybe, but they're not really going to help us with the primary work we have, which is to help kids understand longer works to sustain their attention. And one of the issues is often context. So we're trying to look here at materials that will accompany a central or a classic text to encourage deeper and more expansive reading. And so we already have the extensive in-depth questions, but here we have a series of texts that accompany a major text. And most of them are actually primary texts. I'm going to give you an example here. A few are also nonfiction and they're secondary texts, particularly critical analysis. But these are a series of texts that are related to the central text and interrelated with one another. And so for each chapter, we have text in context that is connected to usually the more, not the more contemporary one, the classic text. So there's one with the Metamorphosis, there's one with Heart of Darkness, there's one with the importance of being earnest, there's one with Hamlet, there's one with Frankenstein, and there's one with Othello. Now, on the next slide, you'll see the Othello one. If we can go to that one, and I'm just going to talk briefly about it. These text in context, I think, are an unusual feature, and I really I hope we get an opportunity to talk about them more fully.